Started. Welcome to Microsoft Expression Blend 3 for developers. My name is Duran Mater. I'm a dev lead on Expression Blend, and I'm hoping to give you a few hints on how you can use Expression Blend, be a little bit more productive in your day-to-day work as a developer. And you might wonder why we called out for developers explicitly in the title for this talk. The basic idea is, in order to get the most compelling content across to you, I wanted to make some certain assumptions about your background, namely that, first of all, that you're focused on the production of user experiences and UI rather than prototyping. So Blend has a lot of capabilities built in for prototyping, namely SketchFlow, and if you're interested in that topic, I encourage you to attend Christian Schorman's talk on SketchFlow at 4:30 today. But for this talk, the tips and tricks are primarily going to be focused on production work and actually building user experiences in WPF and Silverlight. Secondly, I also assume that I'm going to assume you're familiar with Silverlight and WPF already, so I won't have enough time in this short session to give tips and tricks in Blend, as well as an explanation of some complex platform features like data binding and control templating, though I do hope to show you how to use those features inside Blend to make compelling user experiences. And finally, the other sort of main assumption is maybe for developers, we're all a little bit more comfortable working with code directly or maybe hand editing XAML rather than using a design tool such as Blend to generate a lot of the XAML for you. But I assume some familiarity with Blend. And the basic reason why we want to consider using Blend, definitely as you have a .NET application that has a significant amount of complexity to it, is one of the most important things you can do is to keep a clean separation of your model and your view in terms of making your code flexible and maintainable over time. And that separation is facilitated by the rich WPF and Silverlight platform capabilities that you can exploit from XAML. So you actually build a lot of your interactivity and bind to data objects directly from XAML itself. And so if you're building more and more XAML, sometimes it makes sense to do some of your XAML work inside of a tool, especially if that work is visual or interactive in nature. Building it directly using Blend rather than hand editing it out in Visual Studio or a text editor might make a lot of sense. Here's a quick example. If you open Blend, the solution itself, it's a large managed application. It's written mostly in C#. There's some unmanaged components as well. But we have about just under 500,000 lines of C# code, not including test code. But almost 100K lines of XAML. And depending upon how you want to count it, probably about half the XAML comes from system themes and other imported points. But and you can make the argument too, is a line of C# the same as a line of XAML? But the real point is you probably don't want to write out 100K lines of XAML by hand or have anyone doing it, especially that XAML contains features such as animation, complex layouts, control templates, brushes, those kinds of things. You want to use a tool and leverage the ability for Blend to generate that XAML for you, and you know that it's correct and you can see it visually and edit it visually. So the tips and tricks are going to be focused primarily around these areas, the areas where if you already have a workflow for building a WPF or Silverlight application, which maybe involves Visual Studio or hand editing XAML, what's the most bang for the buck you can get by adding Blend into your workflow, and how do you do some of those common tasks and get some hints around things that might be tricky or not otherwise obvious inside Blend. So without further ado, the tips and the tricks. So I'm going to switch over to Blend. This is Blend 3. And the first tip I'm going to show you is that you can press Window Auto Hide Panels to minimize all the panels and run them from a minimize mode and give you the most user screen real estate on the design surface. So each panel is still usable from its minimize mode. And the real point here is that the Blend UI is actually extremely configurable in Blend 3. You can grab panels, you can tear them off, you can float them, you can dock them to different areas of the application UI. You can dock things together. And you can use that and leverage all that to make the Blend application more responsive to your particular setup. And the simplest example of that is that if you have a very small amount of screen real estate, you can use auto hide panels just to get most of that real estate on the design surface. Okay, tip number 2 is on easing functions. Easing functions are a new feature in Silverlight and are going to be in the next version of .NET as well. But basically, the point is you can use an easing function rather than defining a custom animation, and you can actually get a lot of the advantages of using sort of a controlled animation very quickly by picking from either a pre-canned set of easing functions that this platform provides you or implementing your own. And in particular, if you're building interactivity with VSM, the easing functions are actually one of the key tricks that you're going to use to make your interactivity look a lot richer and give your application some life and some pop. And the reason for that, in particular, is with VSM, you define a set of states for your application to be in, and the Visual State Manager automatically generates transitions for you between those states. But the transitions that it generates by default are simply linear interpolations of the property values. And that linear animation is very noticeable. It doesn't look very compelling, especially if you're doing anything more complex than just fading things in and out. So I'm going to show you a quick example of how you might do that in Blend. This is a small snippet of UI, which actually is a master details type setup. So on the left, I have a details mode for a particular selected item in a list, and on the right, I have a custom styled list box. This is nothing more than a WPF list box, a Silverlight list box, with a custom style applied to it. And if I run this application, you can see that it's already been set up. It's already been set up so that the selected item in the list will show the details over here on the right. But you can see the details view by default is already visible even though nothing's selected. If I select something, the details view updates to reflect that. This is all accomplished using data binding. So what I want to show you real quickly in Blend is how I would modify this so that the details view is not visible by default and only becomes visible when the first item is selected. And also I'm going to show how to create an animation so that that animates in rather than simply just appearing out of the blue. So I'm going to use the Blends UI for VSM, create a new visual state group. Let's call it details view states. And I'll create one state which is called expanded, and one state which is called collapsed. And by default, I want the details view to appear collapsed in the collapsed state. And I'm going to do that by scaling it down to 0. So I'll use the Blend's transform UI to set the scale simply down to 0. And by default, it scales around this point, which is the transform center point. And so you can move the center point using the center point adorner, and I'll set it so that it transforms around the center of this UI. So when I scale it down to 0, it's gone. When I go into the expanded state, I just want to scale it back up to 1. It's back. And by default, now I've got something where the UI disappears and comes back and expanded and collapsed. And if I give this a transition duration and turn on transition preview, you can actually see these transitions in the design surface. The UI scales and comes back. And now you can also take a look closely and you can see the linear type of animation that VSM is going to generate for you by default. Not very compelling. And so the tip here is once you have, this is a typical kind of core workflow that you would use VSM for to create this simple type of interactivity. Once you have interactivity like that set up, you can use an easing function to make it pop a little bit more. So I'll add a transition into expanded, and right from this UI, I can set an easing function, and I get an easing function picker that appears in a pop-up, and I can pick any number of easing functions that are defined by the platform or custom easing functions that I have in my application. I'll pick an elastic easing function, and right in the UI, I also get the ability to set particular properties on it using Blend's value editors. And so again, with transition preview, I can see the transition between these two now. I can see that it has a bit of a pop to it, has a bit of a bounce to it, and you can adjust the transition duration to make this look a little bit more, depending upon what your desire is. But the point is, if I wanted to define that animation by hand using keyframes, this would actually take a long time to get that kind of effect. And so these kind of effects can be applied quickly and easily just using easing functions. The one other thing that I'd like to do is to make it so that this expanded state fires as soon as the item in a list box is selected. And by default, keep in mind that it's not going to be visible. To do that, I'm going to use a behavior. So In Blend's asset picker, there are a number of built-in behaviors that Blend provides. One of those is this go to state action. I'll simply drag that on the list box and set it so that when the list box's selection changed event fires, I'll move to the state expanded. And it's that simple to wire up the selection change event to cause a VSM go to state. You can also do it using event handler and calling Visual State Manager go to state from code. And you notice as I do subsequent selections, I don't get additional animations basically because once I've moved into that expanded state, I no longer get a transition into expanded from expanded. So easing functions are a quick way that you can add a pretty rich type of animation to your application without necessarily specifying that animation explicitly. And fundamentally the way they work is they modify the way that the animation occurs over time, that property values change over time. So you're applying a function basically to the t itself in your animation before the animation itself gets applied. And if you can see from this graph, you can actually take normalized time and actually go outside the bounds 0 and 1. So the next tip is in design mode. Doug Olson and Pete Blois actually did a talk in 2008, PDC, called Blend 2 Tips and Tricks, and they talked about this one rather extensively, so definitely go back and take a look at that. But basically, the issue is that if you have an existing code base and you try to open that project inside Blend and you built it using Visual Studio, you haven't actually used Blend before, very often the components that you're referencing in a particular page might throw exceptions when they're used on the design surface. And the reason is it's basically just a new scenario that your components haven't been tested against if they're custom components. It's just some new dimension to your test matrix and you haven't tried it before. And when you do that, typically the thing you want to do is to disable certain functionality at design time because it doesn't make sense. So for example, you may have components that blindly reference into database access. They may reference into static accessors that are declared on your application. They may reference certain APIs that aren't present at design time. And when they do, those components are going to throw exceptions. And there's an example of that on this page. But basically, Blend should trap the exception for you and show you an error message for the particular control that's throwing. This should get you most of the way toward figuring out exactly what's going wrong. If not, again, there's a great tip for debugging your components within Blend. You can launch Visual Studio and open your project in Visual Studio. You can launch Blend and open your project in Blend, and then you can attach the debugger from Visual Studio to the Blend process. And when you do that and turn on first chance exceptions, whenever your code throws an exception in Blend, you're going to trip the Visual Studio debugger, and you can find exactly where your component threw an exception. And again, this was all covered in great detail. I just want to touch on it in the previous Blend tips and tricks talk. But basically, once you figured out where you need to put a particular guard, this is how you would do it. In WPF, it's a little bit trickier. Basically, there's a designer properties is in design mode property. And in Blend and in the Visual Studio Designer, the metadata for dependency object has been overridden so that the value for this property will return true. And this is sort of the canonical way you'd want to do it. You can cache it and put it behind a static accessor. If you've seen a lot of samples, you may have seen samples that call get is in design mode on this, which is maybe not such a great thing to do simply because you're going to call it every time rather than caching the value. And also it assumes that this is something that's derived from dependency object. Dependency object is where the metadata is overridden and you can just walk in and get the value. In Silverlight, this is all wrapped for you behind designer properties is in design tool. And that guard is exactly sufficient to tell you whether or not you're in a design surface such as Visual Studio or Blend. The one other thing that you're going to find in some Silverlight samples is maybe people have code such that says if HTML page is enabled. Keeping on the fact that well, when you're running in Blend, you're not running in a browser. So HTML page is enabled is going to return false in the design surface. And that's maybe what you want to do. But maybe not. The thing is, also when you're running your application in out-of-browser mode, HTML page is enabled is also going to return false. So if you make a Silverlight out-of-browser application, or if you take an existing application and you later want to convert it into out-of-browser mode, if you sprinkled HTML page is enabled throughout your code, you're going to introduce bugs later. So real quick, here's an example. There's a control here. It's a browser detection control. I'll show you the control. Basically just has a couple of text fields, browser name, browser version, and if you look in the constructor, the browser name and browser version text fields are set up to just pick up from the HTML APIs what the name and version are. So this is exactly what's going to throw at design time because these HTML page APIs aren't present. In this case, I do want to use HTML page is enabled as the appropriate guard because I don't want browser information control to do anything in out-of-browser mode as well. And if I add those guards to this control and go back and recompile, you can see that the control no longer throws at design surface. It also no longer initializes those fields at design surface at design time. So this is sort of the workflow that you would go through when you open your project in Blend and you find controls that throw an exception. You either want to debug using Visual Studio or look at the error message, find the particular function that doesn't necessarily work that well at design time, and then use a is in design mode guard to prevent it. One other thing that sort of merits a special note is the isolated storage APIs in Silverlight 3 if you're running on WPF 3.5. So when you run Blend 3, we actually instantiate your control in the design surface. So your control code is running, and if it's running and throws an exception, we're catching the exception that your control code is throwing. If you run a Silverlight control in Blend 3, we actually run it against the desktop.NET framework. And so if there's a system API that's present in Silverlight and not present in the desktop.NET framework, you're actually going to get an error at method JIT time. So any reference to, for example, the isolated storage APIs are going to cause methods that reference those APIs to fail to JIT. So even if you guarded your access to isolated storage APIs, you're still going to get an error at the design surface. So typically what I do in this particular case is to make another method that wraps your access to isolated storage APIs and guard that method using the is in design mode checks, using designer properties is in design tool. Okay. Design time sizing is a new feature that Blend supports, and it supports it more extensively in Blend 3 than it did in Blend 2. The basic idea is when you're creating user controls or many custom components, you don't want to hard code a width and height on those components because when people try and use them, they're going to interfere with the particular layout properties that are set on the particular usage of the control if you provided those same properties at the definition of the control. So for example, if you take a look at, let me just draw a rectangle in Blend and take a look at the XAML that I generated. Here's a XAML for that rectangle. It doesn't specify a width explicitly. And so if somehow there was a default value for width specified, that would interfere with the other layout properties that are actually setting this control up to be positioned as I see it in Blend right now. So typically, you want to let your controls size to content. But if you do that, and your controls don't have any content, then at design time, they may collapse down to a 0 size. And so design width is a way that your controls can be visible and editable at design time, but doesn't interfere with any of the runtime layout behavior. And I'll show you how it works. I'm going to do tools, make user control, and make a new user control out of these components. And when I do that, Blend basically copies all that content over into a new file. It creates a new XAML file, a new CS file called usercontrol.xaml, usercontrol.cs. And actually sets me up with design width and design height already. So if you use Blend to create user controls, typically you're already good to go. But what if I don't have design width and design height set at design time? Then you can see the visual representation for the definition of this user control collapsed down to a minimum set of sizing, which if you're trying to design the look and feel of the control in Blend, isn't going to be that useful to you. And so you can use design width and design height to not affect the runtime behavior, but to actually provide some sizing information for Blend so that when you open this file up, you actually get something that looks reasonable. And the way you can do it is right here. If you select the root of your user control, you notice instead of the default sizing adorners, you actually get, you get a different set of sizing adorners. Oops. You get a different set of sizing adorners that appear outside of the normal sizing adorners. And if you modify these adorners, I'll show you the XAML, you actually create a design time width and height that, design time width and height that actually gets serialized into your document using the XMLNS ignorable namespace. So these properties don't affect your control at runtime, and they don't affect it anywhere in Blend even other than the definition of the control. So you can specify whatever you want to specify here. And by default, like I said, if you use Blend's commands to make a control, these are going to be set up for you by default anyway, so you don't have to worry about specifying them. But if you wanted to modify them, you can use these extra adorners to modify design width and design height. If you go back and actually use the regular resize adorners in Blend, it's going to erase design width and design height and replace them with width and height. So don't do that. Oops. Okay, the next tip is on search. Pretty much everywhere in Blend where there's a complex, large amount of data that shows up in our UI, there's also a search function that just helps you sift through it. So for example, in the asset tool, if I know there's a control called listbox, I want to put a listbox into my scene. Instead of figuring out exactly where that is, I'm just going to start typing, and even if I type LIS, it already narrowed down to all controls which contained LIS, and I can select listbox and just drop it into my scene. For example, in the property inspector, I know there's a property that affects the scroll bar visibility. It's probably scroll something or other, I don't remember. Oh, I typed SCRO, and I've already limited myself and filtered down to the set of properties that affect the scroll bar visibility in listbox. So rather than sifting through large lists of data to try and find something you want, just use some of the search functionality that's built into Blend. Also in the property inspector. I mean, sorry, in the projects pane. Okay, the next tip is on creating control templates in Blend, which is actually a pretty straightforward thing to do if you use the make control command. The make control command actually wraps your existing content and generates a lot of the boilerplate style, template, and visual state manager declarations for you. So if you're trying to build a custom control in Blend, rather than starting with an existing control, you may even consider using the make control command, and actually it creates a lot of things for you by default. I'll show you how to make a custom checkbox right now in Blend. So I'm going to start by just drawing out sort of the check mark. So I'll draw a line, I'll make an X. I'll start by making this stroke a little bit fatter. And maybe I'll copy Control-C, I'll paste Control-V. Now I have two of them, and I'll rotate one around. That'll make an X for my checkbox. I'll select both of these. I'll round the end caps. And I'll make a little border that goes around it. First, let me combine these two objects into a single one using compound path. And I'll add a border, group into border. By default, borders don't have any border thickness or border brush, so it doesn't actually look like anything happened. But I can give it, I can give it a background, and I can give it a border brush, and make the border have some thickness so that you can actually see it. So here's what I've drawn so far. It's an X and a border. Maybe I want to make it so that the X has a little bit of a space around it, so I'll use the margin property to give it a little bit of a margin. Okay, now I've got sort of the foundations of my checkbox. So I want to make it so that this actually is a real checkbox, and the X appears when it's checked and disappears when it's not. One other thing I'm going to do quickly is to drop in a content presenter. If you know the way the Silverlight and WPF controls work, for content controls, there's a content model where they require a content presenter to display content. Blend's make control command is going to actually create a content presenter for you, but because I want to control how this one's positioned, I'm just going to draw it up front. If I select my content presenter and my border, I'll group these objects together into a grid, and I'll take that grid and do tools make into control. And make into control is going to give me a list of types to pick from, but I'm going to show you exactly what it generates when I pick checkbox. Let's go to the XAML. So you can see Blend's generated for me a checkbox style, which sets a template, which is a control template targeting checkbox. There's a number of visual states for checkbox. It's already generated those based on the metadata that the control provides. It's wrapped my content into that particular template, and also it set up some template bindings on my content presenter for horizontal content alignment and vertical content alignment. And the other thing that it's done is Blend's dropped me into a particular mode for control editing. So if I take a look in my object tree right now, you can see that my scene's rooted at my template, and I'm in control editing mode. I can select the contents of that control and do things with it. Like, for example, I can take my content presenter and my border, and I can go object, align, vertical centers. Of course, this has an explicit height on it, so object, align vertical centers. And it's also going to clip to the size of the grid, so even though it is aligned. So now I have something which looks like a checkbox. It is a template for a checkbox, but the functionality of the X, it's really just a graphic right now. But because Blend's already populated the VSM states for me, I really just need to affect the visibility of this particular X glyph in the VSM states, and the control is going to attach the interactivity itself. So when it's unchecked, all I need to do is to select the particular glyph, and I'm going to set its opacity down to 0. And when it's checked, I'll leave it as opacity 1. And in determinant, usually there's another glyph. For now, I'll just make this, let's say, 50% opacity. And if I give this a default transition duration, you can see from a preview, as I click between states, the glyph is going to appear and disappear depending upon the state that the checkbox is in. And if you go to the declaration of this particular instance, which is a checkbox, and take a look at the isChecked property, if I check it, you can see the glyph appears. If I uncheck it, you can see the glyph disappears. So I have a working checkbox template using the make control command. And if you take a look at all the stuff that Blend generated for me versus the things that I had to do myself, this is something that you don't want to necessarily hand edit out a XAML for in order to get something that's basically working. So. Oops. Okay, the next tip is on the resources filter view. So if you have ever had a .NET WF or Silverlight project that approaches some complexity size, you're going to find that you have tons and tons of resources in your project. Resources for styles, templates, brushes, maybe a set of resources that are visible in one theme, a different set for a different theme. The Blend project itself has about 2,300 resources in it. And if you want to know what a particular element is consuming in terms of resources, where did it get its color from, where did it get its brush from, it's occasionally kind of tricky to track some of that stuff down. For example, a control may use a style, which is a resource. The style may use a template, which is another resource. The template may reference brushes. Those may be different resources. The particular brushes may have colors. Those may all be different resources. And so you can use the resources filter view to sift through all that and simply tell you what resources a particular element is using. So in this case, I have a button with a custom template on it. And if I go to the resources pane, I can select this toggle which says show resources used by a selected element. And when I pick that toggle, I get a list of only the resources that affect that particular element. So, and actually edit those right from the resources pane. So here you get, first of all, an audit of everything that's used by a particular element, and you can see basically where particular things are used. And secondly, you get sort of an editable view directly in the resources pane. So. Okay, the next tip is the gradient eyedropper. I don't know if you've seen the regular eyedropper, but in Blend's brushes pane, there is a piece of UI called the color eyedropper, which you can click. You can pick up a color from anywhere, basically really anywhere, by simply mousing over it and clicking, which is, of course, immensely useful. The gradient eyedropper, if you have a gradient brush already selected, this eyedropper now changes into a different mode. If I click and drag, I don't know if you can see that on the projector, you get this sort of linear picker, and this picker, whatever I overlay this picker, Blend will create a gradient that basically interpolates the set of colors that are underneath that line. So for example, if I want to pick up a gradient from this particular brush, from this button, I can simply draw my picker and sort of roughly pick it up. And this is interesting in some cases because if you remember from the resources filter view, this gradient, I don't know if you can tell, but this gradient actually isn't a single gradient. It's composed of a background color and a transparent overlay. So what Blend did for you is sort of composited both of those down into a single gradient and sort of made a sort of approximation on it that has some simplification for editability purposes. The caveats on the gradient eyedropper: it only works within Blend's UI. It doesn't work outside the Blend UI like the color eyedropper does. You can place images in Blend's UI to pick things up from image data. But it's a pretty powerful feature if you get the hang of it. Okay. Design time, sample data, and details mode. So the tip here is really around creating master details type of UI using Blend's UI. And Blend will actually generate a lot of the stuff for you to create working master details setups where the master details works both at runtime and at design time. And I can show you how to do that. But Blend 3 added a lot more support for sample data so that you can visualize data. You can visualize components that depend on data at runtime. You can also visualize that same data at design time. And the basic idea is this: if you have rich set of data templates that display your runtime data, but you want to edit that at design time in Blend, you can build a sample data source that maps to the exact same schema as your runtime data source. And you can either do that by importing an XML file, or you can hand edit the schema using Blend's UI. But the point is, if the schemas line up exactly, you can use Blend's sample data to visualize and to generate data templates and to generate bindings in the UI at design time. And those same bindings are going to work against your data source at runtime. So here we have an example which is already set up, which the schema of my sample data source mimics the schema of what's returned from the Bing image results API. It's actually a subset of it. You can see the sample values here. Basically, Blend also has a number of sample generators that automatically generate different sample data in different formats: strings, numbers, images, and string formats such as email addresses. So you can not only mock up the schema, but you can actually mock up a pretty close representation of the data relatively quickly to kind of exercise what your UI is going to look like. If you drag and drop a particular data source into the design surface, by default, Blend is going to generate a control for you which has the appropriate bindings to that data source, and it's also going to generate a set of data templates that display the set of data that the data source has. So in this case, I've drag and dropped a list box onto the design surface from this list of collection results. And Blend, by default, created a data template for me, which we can see. So I have a list box. It has an item template, which is a specified template that Blend generated for me. I'll show you. And it also has a binding set up so that it bound to the sample data source at design time. The template which is generated is pretty straightforward. It's a basic template. It just has a stack panel, and for each particular data field, a particular type of Silverlight WPF control was generated. So images display image content, text blocks contains string content, and the bindings are set up so that those controls work by default. And you can go into Blend's UI and actually edit these bindings pretty easily. So for example, if I wanted to change the way that this particular set of items was displayed, I can use the template editing commands in Blend. I can select particular items, and using the property inspector, I can center the image. Maybe I don't like the fact that file size is displayed in this view. I can just delete it using the delete key. And you can muck with this pretty straightforward. Let's say, for example, I just wanted the titles in my list box. So this is all basically Blend's sample data feature. And the tip, or the trick in this case, is that you can also use the sample data feature to generate a details view. And so a details view is sort of, if I have selected a particular item in this list, I want to see an expanded view of the properties of that item. You can also generate that view so that it works at runtime and at design time using a Blend sample data UI. And the way to do it is to select this details mode toggle at the top of the pane, which is not entirely obvious. But when you do that, further things that you drag and drop, you'll get a different prompt which simply says create details view. And I'll show you exactly what this does. It creates a grid which is going to sort of serve as the root for your details view. And if you take a look at the XAML which is generated for that grid, at runtime, it has a data context which is bound to the list box's selected item. So Blend found a particular list box which was in your scene, which was using the data source. It gave it a default name, which it didn't have before, and it set up a binding to selected item. So that the selected item for the particular list box is now going to drive the data for this grid. And it also set a design time data context. At design time, because the list box isn't interactive, you're not going to have any selection. So it sets up the design time data context simply to point at the first item in the list. And if you can see, I don't know if you saw the sample values, but basically the first item in the list had a file size which is generated as 10,000, and you can set it to whatever, and you can see that this is actually bound to the first item in the list. So any other thing that I drag into here, again, it's going to be bound at design time to the first item of the list. At runtime, this is going to remap to the selected item. So I can use that to design out a details view over here that's going to work at design time and at runtime. One other quick tip for both of these is that if you drag and drop multiple fields in details mode, you're going to get a row label generation for you that basically takes the name of each of the fields and prepends a text block that has essentially that name built in. So you can use this feature, you cannot use this feature. If you don't want to drag in single fields at a time, if you do want to drag in multiple fields at a time. But then at runtime, this is going to be set up so that the selected item is, again, going to drive the data context for this particular entire grid. So. Okay, so that's basically the set of tips that I've got for you. I've got some other references too. If you're interested in more tips and tricks similar to that, one of the best places you can look is on the Expression team, the Blend and Design team's blog. You can also check out the PDC 2008 talk on tips and tricks, and there's a couple other links here too. Please fill out the feedback session. There's a charity reason for doing so if you haven't heard already. But, I'd like to open it up right now for questions while we have a little bit more time. So. If you have questions, please come up to the microphone. Thanks. Can you come up to the microphone, Doug?
The latest tip you covered with the, I believe, the detailed view
Sure.
for the data source, is that new with Blend 3? Because
Yes, the sample data support is a new feature in Blend 3, as well as the data template generation from drag and drop, also in details mode, yeah.
Okay.
It's all new in Blend 3.
Yeah, because that really, I'm still working with Blend 2, and that really simplifies just, creating that functionality. So just
exactly,
wondering.
yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Sure.
There's an index on the items that are bound. Is that significant? Could it be named, or does it have to be an index on the?
Sorry, which
on
index?
the detail, I think.
Yeah, in the details view, this is the design time binding. It sets it up to point to the first item in the list at design time. Again, whenever you see D: against properties in Blend, they're design time only properties. These properties are set up in markup compatibility, ignorable namespace, and they don't affect the runtime behavior of your application. So there's two data context bindings here. At design time, the D: data context is going to win, and you're going to see the first item in the list. At runtime, there's a second data context binding on the same element, and it's going to bind to the selected item of the list box. So whenever you change selection in the list box, you're going to see the details update based on the selection. Okay.
How do you debug the themes if you have like theming inside a Silverlight XAML, and the theme doesn't work? For example, you have an autocomplete text box and you have a theme, but when you apply it as a static resource, it doesn't work. So how do you get to debug the visual effect? Like, for example, the drop down might not show as you want, but how can you actually figure out what's wrong to track the problem?
Right, so I guess the question is really on, are there some general tips for debugging runtime behavior of components that you design, custom components that you design? We could do, I think, another hour talk on that one in particular. But after this talk, I'm going to be over in the big room in the Expression Lounge. And so for a super detailed question like that, I'd love to just sit down and drill in with you on different things you can do.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Thank you.
Now that there are multiple versions of Silverlight out in the field, sometimes there are applications that you want to work with in Blend 3, but some of the controls aren't available in Silverlight 2. Are there any plans to add like a target framework type property in Blend?
There are, yeah, I would expect there are some plans to add such a thing, yes. We have some other announcements to make at PDC as well, so keep your eyes open. Okay, well, thank everyone for coming. Again, if there's more questions, me and other members of the Expression team will be over in the big room at the Expression Lounge, and be happy to talk to you there.